On May 13th, 1940, a French officer at Sedan watched in horror as German Panzers and Stuka dive bombers shattered his defenses. "We were overwhelmed by a tidal wave," he wrote. "Never have I seen such a rout." What he didn't know, his army had more tanks than the Germans, often better ones. France would fall in 6 weeks, not because of cowardice or weakness, but because the Germans had invented an entirely new kind of war, and the Allies were still fighting the last one. September 1939. Poland falls in weeks, but then silence. For 8 months, the Western Front sees almost no fighting. The French call it the drôle de guerre, the Phony War. Behind the massive concrete fortifications of the Maginot Line, French and British commanders are confident. They have more tanks, more men, and the lessons of 1914 to 1918 on their side. This confidence wasn't entirely misplaced, at least not on paper. France deployed 3,254 tanks versus Germany's 2,439. The French Char B-1 boasted heavy armor and dual guns, a 47mm turret gun and 75mm hull gun, vastly superior in firepower and protection to the Panzer IV's armor up to 30mm and 75mm short-barreled gun. French and British forces numbered 144 divisions against Germany's 141. By every conventional measure, the Allies held the advantage, but numbers can lie. And in the spring of 1940, they were lying spectacularly. The man embodying Allied strategy was General Maurice Gamelin, France's commander-in-chief. A veteran of the Great War, Gamelin favored static defense and methodical battle doctrine, the approach that had ground Germany down between 1914 and 1918. He expected history to repeat itself, a German advance through Belgium, mirroring the 1914 Schlieffen Plan, followed by years of grinding warfare. His entire defensive scheme hinged on this assumption. This was intelligence's deadliest sin, mirror imaging enemy intentions. The Allies convinced themselves that Germany would fight the last war, not a new one. When reconnaissance reported German armor massing in the Ardennes forest, French high command dismissed it as a feint. After all, everyone knew the Ardennes was impassable to tanks. Too hilly, too forested, too narrow. They left it defended by second-rate divisions and focused their best forces north, preparing to meet the Germans in Belgium. Behind the scenes, Germany was revolutionizing warfare itself. General Erich von Manstein's audacious Sickelschnitt, the sickle cut through the Ardennes, faced months of skepticism from the German high command. Hitler's own conference notes reveal his doubts about gambling everything on this single thrust. "What if the French see it coming?" he asked. "What if we get trapped in those forests?" But Manstein persisted. He showed the maps. He ran war games. He argued that the Allies were so fixated on Belgium that they'd left their center wide open. By spring 1940, 7 panzer divisions were secretly concentrating in precisely the terrain the Allies had written off as impassable. Thousands of tanks, tens of thousands of troops, all hidden in forests the French believed would protect them. The stage was set for a collision between two eras of warfare. The Allies expected World War I-style attrition. Germany was about to deliver something else entirely. A system of speed and coordination that would turn superior numbers into irrelevant statistics. But in the forests of the Ardennes, that impassable terrain the Allies had dismissed, columns of German panzers were massing. What the Allies didn't know, they were about to face not just a different army, but a different kind of war entirely. On May 10th, 1940, the illusion shattered. Here's the paradox that decided the campaign. On paper, France should have won. They had more tanks, better tanks. France fielded 730 Char B-1s and Somua S-35s, approximately 300 Char B-1 and 430 Somua S-35, heavily armored tanks that could shrug off German anti-tank rounds. But there was one crucial difference. The casualty statistics would reveal only in hindsight. Inside every German tank, there was a radio. This wasn't about technology for technology's sake. It was about fundamentally reimagining what a tank was. The French saw tanks as mobile artillery, individual weapons supporting infantry. The Germans saw them as nodes in a network. Of Germany's 2,439 tanks, only 627 were the medium Panzer III and IV models. The rest were light Panzer Is and IIs, barely more than machine gun carriers. Yet every single one could communicate. French tanks had one-man turrets and almost no radios. A French tank commander had to load the gun, aim, fire, command his crew, and navigate, all simultaneously. He couldn't coordinate with the tank beside him because they literally couldn't talk to each other. They were fighting blind and deaf. When a French unit spotted a German breakthrough, they couldn't warn anyone. They couldn't call for help. They couldn't concentrate force where it mattered most. German doctrine transformed this communication advantage into a killing system. Every panzer could receive orders and report enemy positions in real time. They moved as formations, not collections of individuals. When a German commander spotted a weakness, he could concentrate force within minutes. When French commanders spotted the same weakness, they had to dispatch motorcycle couriers through roads already under German fire, then wait for permission from headquarters that might be 50 kilometers away, then try to coordinate units that couldn't communicate with each other. The tempo difference was devastating. German panzers advanced 30 to 40 kilometers per day. French doctrine anticipated 5 to 10, the pace of the Great War. This 4 to 6 times speed difference created strategic paralysis. Allied commanders were making decisions about situations that no longer existed by the time the orders arrived. They were fighting ghosts. By the time they figured out where the Germans were, the panzers had already moved somewhere else, and the radios were just the beginning. Enter General Heinz Guderian, commander of 19th Panzer Corps, the man who would prove the concept in Blood and Steel. His diary reveals a commander constantly at war with his own superiors. "They want me to halt," he wrote on May 15th. "They fear we're moving too fast, that we'll be cut off, but the French are in chaos. If we stop now, we give them time to recover. I will not stop." Guderian embodied the doctrine the Germans called Auftragstaktik, mission-type orders. Tell your subordinates what to achieve, not how to do it. Let them exploit opportunities as they emerge. The French system required approval from above for every significant decision. Methodical battle, they called it, the doctrine that had ground Germany down between 1914 and 1918. But Guderian wasn't fighting a battle of attrition. He was orchestrating a symphony of violence. Stukas screamed down to shatter defensive positions. Panzers punched through the gaps. Motorized infantry flooded forward to hold the breakthrough. Each element synchronized not through rigid plans, but through shared understanding and constant communication. When a Stuka pilot spotted French tanks massing for a counterattack, he radioed the coordinates. Within minutes, German armor was moving to intercept. The French tanks arrived to find panzers already in position, waiting. This radio revolution, combined with dive bombers, motorized infantry, and commanders empowered to exploit breakthroughs without waiting for orders, was about to be tested in the most dramatic way possible. The target, a quiet sector of the French line along the Meuse River at Sedan. May 13, 1940, Sedan. French defenders on the Meuse River hear a sound they'll never forget. The screaming sirens of Stuka dive bombers, hundreds of them, concentrated on a single sector. The sirens aren't accidental. German engineers designed them specifically to terrify. For 8 hours, the bombing continues. The earth shakes, bunkers collapse, communications break down, officers can't reach their commanders. Then, as darkness falls, German engineers begin crossing the river in rubber boats. By dawn, panzers are rolling across pontoon bridges. The French center has been shattered. This is the moment the Phony War dies. 3 days earlier, May 10th, German armor had entered the Ardennes. That same forest Allied intelligence had deemed impassable to tanks. 7 panzer divisions, thousands of vehicles. They moved in columns stretching for miles, engines roaring, tracks chewing through forest roads the French said couldn't handle them. Reconnaissance aircraft reported the massive concentration. French pilots took photographs. They counted tanks. They radioed headquarters with urgent warnings. Gemelin dismissed it as a feint. He remained convinced the main attack was coming through Belgium, exactly as in 1914. He kept his best reserves in the north, the Ardennes sector, defended by second-rate divisions, many of them reservists who hadn't seen combat since the Great War. By May 13th, German armor had crossed terrain the Allies thought would take weeks to traverse. They'd done it in 72 hours, and now at Sedan, they were demonstrating what concentrated air power and armor could achieve. French officers would later describe it as a tidal wave. One wrote, "The bombing was unlike anything we'd experienced. Not scattered attacks, but wave after wave, all hitting the same positions. We couldn't respond, we couldn't even think." By the time the bombing stopped and German engineers began their crossing, many French units were already broken. Soldiers huddled in craters. Officers tried to rally their men, but couldn't be heard over the continuing explosions. When German infantry reached the far bank, they found defenders too stunned to fight effectively. Within 48 hours of the breakthrough, Guderian's 19th Panzer Corps was racing west, covering 30 to 40 kilometers per day, speeds that Allied doctrine said were impossible. Remember that French methodical battle concept? It anticipated 5 to 10 kilometers per day at most. German panzers were moving 4 to 6 times faster than Allied commanders could conceptualize. Yet here's what the myth of invincibility conceals. Up to 50% of German panzers were temporarily out of action during this advance, victims of mechanical failure and fuel shortages. Guderian's own diary records his fury at halt orders from nervous superiors. May 15th, ordered to halt. "I refuse. The enemy is in flight. We must pursue." His threats to disobey became so frequent that his superiors threatened to relieve him of command. They were right to worry. German logistics were stretched to breaking point. Fuel trucks couldn't keep up with the advancing panzers. Supply lines stretched thin across hundreds of kilometers, and the French did fight back. On May 17th, a young colonel named Charles de Gaulle launched a counterattack at Montcornet with his 4th Armored Division. De Gaulle had studied German tactics. He understood concentration of force. For a few hours, his attack succeeded. French tanks pushed German infantry back. They destroyed supply trucks. They created panic in German rear areas. But de Gaulle had no air support, no radios that could coordinate with other French units, no backing from high command, who still didn't understand what was happening. German Stukas arrived within hours. Without anti-aircraft guns or fighter cover, de Gaulle's tanks were sitting targets. He was forced to withdraw. His tactical success changed nothing strategically. The Germans simply flowed around the disruption and kept moving. By May 20th, the question wasn't whether the line would hold. It was whether the Germans could be stopped before they reached the English Channel. The answer would come in just 1 week. May 20th, 1940. A German motorcycle reconnaissance unit reaches the English Channel at Abbeville. The lead rider stops his bike. He looks out at the water. Behind him, his commander radios headquarters. "We have reached the sea." In Paris, French Prime Minister Paul Reynaud receives the news and asks his generals a simple question: how is this possible? No one has an answer. In just 10 days, German armor has driven from the Ardennes to the Channel, cutting the Allied armies in two. The best French divisions, the ones Gamelin had positioned in Belgium, are now trapped. So is the entire British Expeditionary Force, over 1 million men caught in a pocket with their backs to the sea. This is what strategic paralysis looks like. Guderian's 19th Panzer Corps has covered over 200 kilometers in less than 2 weeks. a rate of advance that Allied doctrine considered physically impossible. French and British commanders are making decisions about situations that no longer exist. By the time orders reach frontline units, German Panzers have already moved another 40 kilometers. A French staff officer wrote in his diary, "We receive reports that are obsolete before we finish reading them. We issue orders to positions already overrun. We are fighting blind against an enemy who sees everything." On May 17th, in a desperate attempt to salvage the situation, Gamelin is replaced by General Maxime Weygand. It's far too late. Cabinet minutes from May 13th and 14th reveal the scale of panic in the French government as the breakthrough's magnitude became clear. Ministers argued, some wanted to sue for peace immediately, others demanded counterattacks, but no one could explain how the Germans had moved so fast, how they'd broken through defenses that were supposed to hold for months. Weygand arrives to find not a front line, but a catastrophe. Entire divisions cut off, communications severed, German armor pouring through gaps no one can close. He orders a coordinated counterattack from north and south, trying to pinch off the German spearhead. But the French units in the north can't communicate with units in the south. They can't coordinate timing. They can't even confirm whether the other half of the attack is happening. For General Lord John Gort, commander of the British Expeditionary Force, the encirclement presents impossible choices. His war diaries capture mounting frustration with the confused Allied command structure. Conflicting orders arrive from London and Paris, each demanding actions that contradict the other. The French want him to attack south to help close the gap. The British War Office wants him to secure his supply lines to the Channel ports, but those ports are already falling to German panzers racing along the coast. Gort faces a terrible decision: obey French orders and risk the destruction of the British army, or disobey and abandon France to its fate. On May 25th, he makes his choice. He orders the BEF to fall back toward Dunkirk, the last port still in Allied hands. Here's where we need to confront the myth directly: the narrative that France simply gave up. The casualty figures tell a different story. During this single week, May 14th to 21st, French losses are catastrophic. Units fight to annihilation, defending river crossings, road junctions, anything that might slow the German advance. At the fortress city of Lille, French forces hold out for days against overwhelming German attacks. 7 German divisions, troops desperately needed at Dunkirk, are tied down trying to reduce this single pocket of resistance. The defenders know they're doomed. They fight anyway. One soldier wrote his final letter home: "We will not surrender. We will buy time for others to escape. Tell my children I died doing my duty." These defenders are buying time with their lives, making the evacuation that follows possible, but courage can't overcome doctrinal obsolescence. French units fight bravely, but they fight in isolation. Their one-man tank turrets and missing radios reduce them to static strong points rather than mobile formations. The Germans flow around these pockets of resistance like water around stones. By May 21st, the trap has closed. The British Expeditionary Force, the best French divisions, and the entire Belgian army, over 1 million men, are encircled in a shrinking pocket along the Channel coast. One port remains open: Dunkirk. What happens next will be called a miracle, but it's really a catastrophe with a silver lining. For 9 days, the beaches of Dunkirk became a vision of apocalypse. Thousands of men stood in lines stretching into the sea, waiting for rescue, while German bombers circled overhead. The British called it a miracle, the French called it abandonment. Both were right. Between May 26th and June 4th, 1940, 338,000 Allied troops were evacuated across the Channel, a feat of improvisation and courage that would sustain British morale through the dark years ahead. Fishing boats, pleasure yachts, destroyers, anything that could float made the crossing. Ships burned, men drowned, but the evacuation continued. A British soldier who survived later wrote, "It was hell on earth. Shells, bombs, men screaming, ships burning. Yet somehow we held on and made it home. That somehow had a name. The controversial German halt order that paused the panzer advance just as the trap was closing. On May 24th, with German tanks just 10 miles from Dunkirk, Hitler ordered them to stop. His generals were furious. Guderian raged in his diary, "We have them trapped." Why are we stopping? But Hitler feared the rapid victory was, in his own words, too good to be true, a trap waiting to spring. Goering promised that the Luftwaffe alone could finish the job. Hitler believed him. This wasn't German mercy, it was logistical reality and political anxiety. Remember those mechanical failures that had plagued the advance? By the time panzers reached Dunkirk, they'd been racing for 2 weeks straight. Fuel trucks couldn't keep up. Tanks needed maintenance. Supply lines stretched thin across hundreds of kilometers. And Hitler, remembering the trenches of World War I, feared his precious panzers would be destroyed in urban fighting. The halt order gave the Allies just enough time to organize the evacuation. German bombers attacked relentlessly, but without ground forces pressing the perimeter, British and French troops held. The beaches became a killing ground, but the ships kept coming. Yet while soldiers crowded Dunkirk's beaches, 8 to 10 million French civilians fled south in what became known as the Exode, history's largest refugee exodus to that point. Roads choked with families, carts, cars, and livestock stretched for hundreds of miles. German bombers and fighters strafed these columns deliberately. The Luftwaffe pilots had their orders: create panic, clog the roads, make it impossible for French forces to move north. Between 35,000 and 40,000 civilians died. An eyewitness recorded, "We walked for days with no food, no water, only fear and the roar of planes above. I saw a mother carrying her dead child, refusing to believe she was gone. I saw old men collapse by the roadside, too exhausted to continue. The planes came back again and again, shooting at anything that moved." This humanitarian catastrophe compounded the military collapse, traumatizing an entire generation. France wasn't just losing a war, it was watching its civilization dissolve. Paris fell on June 14th, declared an open city to spare it from destruction. German troops marched down the Champs-Élysées. Swastika flags flew from the Eiffel Tower. By then, French casualties had demolished any narrative of cowardice. 90,000 military deaths, more than British losses in the Battle of Britain and North Africa combined, alongside 200,000 wounded and 1.5 million prisoners of war. Among those who fought hardest were colonial troops from Senegal, Morocco, and Algeria. They suffered disproportionate casualties, and when they surrendered, many faced execution under Nazi racial policies. German soldiers, indoctrinated with beliefs about racial superiority, murdered black African soldiers rather than take them prisoner. This atrocity remains one of the campaign's lesser-known tragedies. The German victory, while stunning, had cost 27,000 killed, 111,000 wounded, 795 aircraft lost, and 753 tanks destroyed or damaged. These were significant losses that revealed Blitzkrieg's risks even in triumph. The Wehrmacht wasn't invincible. It was innovative, aggressive, and lucky. But the myth of invincibility was already forming. On June 22, 1940, in a railway car in the forest of Compiègne, the same car where Germany had surrendered in 1918, France signed the Armistice. Hitler insisted on the location. He wanted to erase the humiliation of 1918. He wanted to prove that Germany's defeat had been reversed. In 6 weeks, the world had changed. The myth of French invincibility was replaced by the myth of German invincibility. Both myths were false, but the second would shape the next 5 years of war. It would embolden Hitler to invade the Soviet Union, convinced that Blitzkrieg could work anywhere, against anyone. It would cost millions of lives before it was finally shattered in the snows of Stalingrad and the hedgerows of Normandy. In 6 weeks, the world's assumptions about military power lay in ruins alongside the French Third Republic. The Blitzkrieg had proven that ideas, radio coordination, combined arms, decentralized initiative could defeat superior numbers and equipment. The myth of Wehrmacht invincibility was born, emboldening Hitler toward his fatal overreach in the Soviet Union. But the real lesson, still relevant today, in warfare, the side that reimagines the battlefield itself holds the ultimate advantage. The French weren't defeated by German tanks. They were defeated by a revolution in thinking they never saw coming. They had more tanks, better tanks, more men, but they were fighting yesterday's war with yesterday's doctrine. And in 1940, that was enough to destroy them.